Hi, Dr. Wooler here for Great Plains Laboratory. This is the monthly installment for the Great Plains Laboratory sponsored complimentary webinars. I want to give a good shout out to them for really, hosting these webinars now for many years. I've been doing these, I forget now how many years I've been doing these webinars, quite a bit. So what I thought we would do in this month's installment is do a talk on autism and mold exposure and why the mycotoxin test is important to do, not just solely relying on symptoms or solely relying on something like the organic acids test, which is an important test, but why the mycotox profile is worth doing as well. So for those of you who have not heard me before, I'm Dr. Kurt Wooler. I've been an integrative and functional medicine physician for over 20 years. I've also been working with individuals with autism since about that time, actually 1998. So I've had a lot of experience now over the past number of decades. I do a lot of clinical education for Great Plains Laboratory. I speak for them throughout the United States at conferences as well as internationally. I also do a lot of my own education through something called Integrative Medicine Academy, which is an online training academy for health professionals interested in learning more about specific topics related to integrative and functional medicine. And as I mentioned before, I've been working with autistic individuals now for over 20 years. I work with patients with autoimmune disorders, gastrointestinal, as well as neurological problems. So let's get into it. So what are molds? So molds are fungi. So they fall under the biological group of what's called fungi. Now what's interesting is that Candida falls under the biological group of fungi. So do mushrooms. Yeast, so Candida is, for an example, is a type of yeast, but it is also a fungi. Aspergillus is a type of mold, but it too is a fungi. But Aspergillus is not a yeast and Candida is not a mold. So they're kind of separated in their own groups, but they all fall under this biological group called fungi. So these fungus can grow indoors and outdoor environments. A lot of people think you have to have some, really wet environment to get fungi. There's molds that actually grow in the desert. And it's not known exactly how many of these molds are out there, tens to hundreds of thousands. And I'm sure there's probably some that have never been discovered in some deep recesses of planet Earth somewhere. It's true, most grow in damp, humid conditions, but again, they can also survive in harsh environments as well. So for example, the Southwest part of the United States has a specific mold called coccidiomycosis, which people develop a lung infection from. And molds can spread and reproduce by mold spores. So a very common mold that all of us can be exposed to is Aspergillus, and there's different species of Aspergillus, but a Aspergillus infection in the lungs or anywhere in the body really is called Aspergillosis. And a lot of times people can be breathing in Aspergillus spores, which in some people might trigger a respiratory issue, a sinus issue, or some people may not notice at all because their immune system can handle it. Aspergillus can be linked to allergic type reactions. In fact, Aspergillus has actually been linked to something called an aspergilloma, where you get Aspergillus mold that grows in the lungs. And those are really more severe infections. And then there's other types of mold like Stachybotrys. This is that green, that black mold that so many people are concerned about with good reason. As Stachybotrys usually needs a constant source of water. So high humidity, high condensation. And so it really needs a lot of moisture required for its growth, but it can produce chemicals which are pretty nasty. In fact, the things called trichothecenes, or chemicals produced by Stachybotrys that have inflammatory effects. It can be immune suppressive. It can create autoimmune reactions, carcinogenic, causes liver damage, kidney damage, etc. So mycotoxins are toxins produced by mold. So myco means of fungal origin. And these mycotoxins are chemicals produced by molds that have a toxic effect. So what's interesting is, unlike a lot of bacterial toxins, these mycotoxins aren't easily detected by the immune system. So they can store and hide in the body for years. In fact, they can severely disrupt cellular function because mycotoxins can easily get into the cells, and that can affect protein production, which could have an influence on immune function, affect DNA and RNA synthesis within the nucleus of the cell. These mycotoxins are damaging because they can damage the mitochondria, which are the energy factories of our cells, produces the energy currency to run our body, and they can create toxic reactions that deplete glutathione. And glutathione, we know, is important because it is a major antioxidant that protects our cells, protects our mitochondria, aids in detoxification. Now, some people who get exposed to mycotoxins may not really correlate some of their symptoms to a mycotoxin. So headaches, for example, or perhaps disruption in sleep. And then, more severe issues like cancer, immune suppression, liver, kidney issues certainly can be correlated as well, and really should be tested for in everybody. So water damage in homes, water damage in schools, water damage in residential facilities, nursing homes, can be fairly common in certain areas of the country who get a lot of rain or water damage, like hurricane damage, Florida, Houston, for example. It's well known that mold can be an issue. But it doesn't matter whether you live in a humid, dry, wet type of environment. If there's a water leak in the home, you're going to get mold, potentially. Food can also be a common source. And the agricultural industry knows all about the dangers of mycotoxin in food, because these mycotoxins can severely compromise the health of livestock. So, and that's a billion-dollar industry, so they're all over it. Fruit, dairy, cheese, grains, bread can all be sources of mold. So we've known for a long time how beneficial the organic acids test from Great Plains Laboratory is, and I do a lot of education on the use and incorporation of the OAT test into practice. In fact, the organic acid test is, to me, kind of the hub of the wheel from a testing standpoint. It's something that should never be skipped. But these other tests, like the Mycotox profile or the GPL tox profile, even the glyphosate test, are all complementary to the OAT. And there are certain markers on the OAT that can indicate mold exposure. So organic acids are chemical compounds that we all produce, so that they're a natural part of our own metabolism. So for example, lactic acid, we all produce lactic acid at a certain level. It's an organic acid. Okay, organic acids are substances that contain carbon and hydrogen. Those are always present. Some organic acids might contain oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur, it just depends. But lactic acid, for example, is something that we all produce. And then there are organic acids that organisms produce. So if we have, the bacteria that live in our digestive system, yeast, for example, they too produce organic acids. And so those organic acids get produced in the digestive system, get absorbed, circulated throughout the body, and then are dumped in the urine. So most organic acids are easily tested through urine assessment because they're highly concentrated in the urine versus the blood. And this is something that Dr. Shaw, who founded Great Plains Laboratory, saw many years ago, and he was looking at a couple individuals with autism, was that the autistic kids tended to have a lot more certain organic acids that were representative of digestive system imbalances versus neurotypical individuals. So we know that autistic kids tend to have a lot more oxalic acid, for example, or they might have other markers reflective of bacteria as well as yeast. The oat does have markers that indicate mold exposure. So if you've ever looked at an organic acid test, if you're a practitioner listening on a patient or perhaps you're a parent, page 1, the top section of page 1 is, let me get a different color pen, red. So the top section of page 1 of the oat has these yeast and fungal markers. Now, arabinose is linked to invasive candida. There's a few others like carboxycitric and 3-oxobutyric can be linked to just general yeast. But when it comes to mold, markers 2, 4, and 5 are linked to Aspergillus mold, and now tartaric, number 6, is also being linked to Aspergillus. So you can see in this particular person, 2, 4, and 5 are elevated. So I know going in that they have exposure to Aspergillus mold. Now, what I don't know is the mold in the gut? Is it in the lungs or the sinuses? Well, it could be in all 3, but if people aren't having sinus problems or respiratory issues, then you're looking at essentially Aspergillus mold in the digestive system. It's colonizing the gut. There's another marker on the oat called tricarboxylic. Tricarboxylic is linked to a mold called Fusarium. Fusarium mold is also found in the environment, can be found in water-damaged buildings, for example, but it's also a common contaminant of grains, so corn and corn products, for example. And what happens is the tricarboxylic marker, even though it's not high in this person, the tricarboxylic marker gets produced because Fusarium produces a chemical when it's in the digestive system that gets converted into the organic acid tricarboxylic. So, does the oat provide enough information on mold exposure to avoid doing the mycotox test? Well, the answer is no. You still need to do the mycotox profile because there are many other mycotoxins that don't get produced by Aspergillus or Fusarium mold. So you might find other mycotoxins like Reuridin E or verrucarin, for example. And I'll talk about some others. These are produced by Stachybotrys. So don't just assume that the oat provides enough information on mold. The oat, and from my view, is always a test to be done. The mycotox test is incredibly important too. You don't want to skip it. So it's interesting, there's some recent information that's come out about Ochratoxin and autism. Came out in Nutritional Neuroscience just this past year, actually. A number of researchers out of Italy were looking at different mycotoxins, and it's linked to autism. And the main one that they were focusing on was Ochratoxin. Ochratoxin is produced by Aspergillus mold most commonly. It can damage the DNA. It can damage the RNA. It can damage protein development. That can have an influence on immune function. That can have an influence on brain nervous system function. It inhibits certain enzymes in the kidneys, so it can lead to kidney damage. As we can see here, this image I grabbed is actually from a mycotox profile. We can see here a high level of Ochratoxin. So it's kidney toxic, it's immune toxic, it's even carcinogenic. Grains, cereals, dairy, coffee can be a source of Ochratoxin, dried fruit. Some people say, well, how is dairy a source of Ochratoxin? Well, a cow who eats contaminated grain, the mycotoxin gets into the cow and then it gets into their milk. It's possible that it could come from mold from a water damaged building. One of the interesting things about Ochratoxin, and this isn't to say it happens all the time, but the Ochratoxin can cause nerve system damage where we can have low levels of dopamine. So if you look at an organic acid test, that may show up as low levels of HVA. HVA is the metabolite of dopamine. It's found under the neurotransmitter section of the O test. So what these researchers found was a strong correlation to the pathobiology of autism being linked to ochratoxin. So ochratoxin in these slides is abbreviated OTA. One of the things is that ochratoxin competed or competes with phenylalanine. Phenylalanine is an amino acid that is a precursor to dopamine production. We know that we need dopamine for attention and focus. Dopamine also has an interesting relationship to oxytocin. So if we inhibit phenylalanine, inhibit dopamine, that could influence oxytocin function. Oxytocin is often deficient in autism. Oxytocin is that pro-social hormone that's important for engagement, social interest, etc. Ochratoxin alters neurodevelopment, and specifically what it's doing is it seems to influence adversely synapse functions. So in the nervous system, nerve cells communicate with each other through the synapse, that space between nerve cells where our neurochemicals have to cross. And so this can lead to not only neurological but also psychiatric issues, because it can alter the function of the synapse, and that synapse might be a synapse that is sequencing or transmitting serotonin or dopamine or norepinephrine, for example. It also turns out that ochratoxin in males does not get degraded by certain detoxifying enzymes. So males don't express certain enzymes that effectively break down ochratoxin. We know that there's a 4-to-1 ratio in autism between males to females. And in part, this might explain that. I don't want to say it fully explains that because there's other variables too. But it's interesting how ochratoxin could affect certain enzymes in the liver that are necessary for detox. Ochratoxin's disruption of liver enzymes could have a consequence on gut function. Because anytime that we're not breaking down toxins in the liver effectively, some of those toxins can find their way intact into the digestive system. And if you look at the anatomy, the liver dumps things into the biliary system. The biliary system has an exit point in the small intestine. So you still have to go through the entire small intestine to the large intestine to be dumped out in the stool. And the small intestine is all about immune function in the gut as well as absorption of nutrients. So it can be linked through dysfunction throughout the digestive system to leaky gut. And anytime we have leaky gut, that's going to increase inflammation, increase food sensitivity, and typically many of these mycotoxins like ochratoxin are also immune suppressive. So our digestive system is our largest immune organ. If we suppress immune function in the gut, we're now decreasing, I guess the other way around. If we're decreasing immune function in the gut, we're increasing the opportunity for opportunistic infections. And so there are, many things that's kind of interesting when we start looking back at supplements or diet, can have a beneficial effect at reducing the toxic load of things like ochratoxin. What we don't know, obviously, is how well any one thing works in just one person. But in this particular article, they were talking about, how green tea, for example, or certain prebiotics might help in the processing of ochratoxin. Now, probably how these things are helping is that eating a robust diet, healthy amount of fiber and different plant-based foods, just improves the environment for bacterial diversity within the gut. So it improves the status of the microbiome. And so we get an increase of healthy lactobacillus bacteria, bifidobacter bacteria. Well, one of the things they found was that lactobacillus and bifidobacterium help to counteract some of the mycotoxic exposure of ochratoxin. So it may be that some of the benefit we're seeing from just probiotics in autism is some kind of downregulation effect of ochratoxin. We just haven't known that because the Mycotox test hasn't really been out that long, and this information just wasn't known. So that's ochratoxin, and that has it seems to have a very strong correlation to autism. Now, the article didn't talk about some of these other mycotoxins, but I want to go through this and show you a scenario about how other mycotoxins can be a problem too. Let's focus on gliotoxin and something called mycophenolic. Mycophenolic is a common mycotoxin seen on the Mycotox test, and it's produced by Penicillium mold, another common mold in the environment. Mycophenolic is immune suppressive. And here's the key. Increases of mycophenolic will increase the chances of opportunistic infections, such as Candida, as well as Clostridia. In fact, this particular sample you see here comes from an autistic child who has not only high levels of Candida, okay, we notice that the arabinose level's high. We've got some other yeast markers like carboxycitric, and our tartaric is high as well. So we've got invasive Candida, but we also have a lot of Clostridia bacterial toxins. In fact, there's 3 of them, which is not very common. And here's our mycotoxin level. Our mycophenolic level is very high. So the mycophenolic can create an environment that can lead to an overgrowth of many of these opportunistic pathogens. And if you've heard some of my talks before, you know that Clostridia bacteria has many negative effects in the body. We know that Clostridia bacteria can create digestive system problems, but the organic acid test allows us to evaluate for other toxins produced by different species of Clostridia bacteria. So for example, on the oat test, we can look at something called homovanillic. Homovanillic is linked to the status of dopamine. We can look at something called vanillmandylic acid. Vanillmandylic acid is linked to the status of norepinephrine. In normal biochemistry, what should happen is that dopamine gets converted to norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is important for attention and focusing, but norepinephrine also gets produced into converted epinephrine. Epinephrine is important for cardiovascular function, for energy production. It has a regulating effect over metabolism. And in the presence of these Clostridia toxins like 4-creosol, or I should say and/or HPHPA, which are measurable off the organic acid test, these toxins can inhibit this converting enzyme called dopamine beta hydroxylase. So as the dopamine beta hydroxylase becomes inhibited, we can see an increase of dopamine that's measurable on the oat with an increase of homovanillic acid. Real quickly, one of the problems with increased dopamine and then increased HBA is that dopamine itself can break down into toxic compounds. It breaks down into a specific chemical that actually can directly damage and actually trigger nerve cells in the brain and nervous system to commit suicide. So excess dopamine is a toxin within the brain and nervous system, you know, when it's in a chronically elevated state. And one of the things we also see with some of the autistic kids when dopamine is in excess is it can trigger behavioral problems like aggression, self-injurious behavior, irritability, and in extreme cases, it's been linked to psychosis. So these mycotoxins create an environment that can increase increase infections in the digestive system. And this is exactly what Great Plains has found, is that the individuals who tend to have higher levels of mycotoxins often have higher levels of organic acid markers linked to Candida and Clostridia. Excuse me a second here. Another mycotoxin found on the mycotox profile is gliotoxin. Gliotoxin is also produced by Aspergillus, and it's a real problem because it too can have immune suppressive effects. So it also is correlated to a lot of neurological problems. One of the other issues with gliotoxin, notice in this person, the levels are extremely high. In fact, this is still, to date, the highest level of gliotoxin I've ever seen in anybody. In fact, when I talked to one of the representatives at Great Plains in the lab, at that time, now maybe that's changed from their standpoint, but at that time, that was the highest level of gliotoxin that they had seen. Turns out gliotoxin can damage mitochondria. If you look at page 2 of the organic acid test, the middle section of page 2 is looking at mitochondrial activity. So it's looking at something called glycolytic metabolites, which is linked to glucose metabolism, our Krebs cycle, and then markers linked to what's called the electron transport chain as part of our mitochondrial activity. And remember, the mitochondria produce ATP, this energy currency chemical, which is needed to run the machinery of our body. One of the things that's recognized on the oat test is high levels of lactic acid being linked to mycotoxins. Now, there's other things that can cause lactic acid to be high, but mycotoxins are commonly associated with it. So here we've got gliotoxin as a damaging mycotoxin of mitochondria. And if we look at this person's oat, we can see a lot of mitochondrial markers are elevated, indicating mitochondrial dysfunction. So again, the mitochondria are these organelles inside our cells. They're the energy factories of our cells that produce the energy currency chemical called ATP. Skeletal muscle, gastrointestinal system, our liver, our brain, our immune system, all need ATP to function appropriately. And there's many things that can negatively impact the mitochondria, from nutritional deficiencies to inflammation to Clostridia toxins to Candida toxins, as well as mycotoxins. So you always need to consider mycotoxins as something that can be a contributing factor to mitochondrial problems. Well, another area on the organic acid test that is common in autism is high oxalate levels. Notice in this particular individual, we've got a very high level of oxalic acid. Oxalic or oxalate is an organic compound that we can acquire from many different kinds of foods: soy, spinach, kale, beets, nuts, for example. And oxalates can lead to a lot of problems. It can lead to kidney stones, it can lead to mineral imbalances, it can lead to arthritic pain, fibromyalgia-like discomfort, urinary discomfort, behavioral problems in kids. Well, Aspergillus can produce oxalic acid. It also turns out that Candida, certain species of Candida, can actually contribute to oxalates as well. So in this particular person, they had very high levels of Aspergillus markers. They had very high levels of Ochratoxin. I'm not saying that the Mycotoxin is leading to the oxalic acid, but the Aspergillus is what's causing most of that oxalate to be high. So in this particular slide, the Aspergillus is associated to the Mycotoxin, Ochratoxin, and the Aspergillus is also linked to oxalic acid. So I guess, you know, in some regards, you could make the claim that oxalic acid might be, you know, it's another toxin of Aspergillus. But we know that we can get oxalate from other sources. So oxalate coming from Aspergillus can complex with many different things. It can complex with calcium and other minerals like zinc, even heavy metals in the body. These oxalates can form these crystals too. It just so happens that when we have high oxalates, it's most commonly binding to calcium to form what's called a calcium oxalate crystal. This is also called a salt, sort of similar to sodium chloride, like your table salt. You form basically a sodium chloride crystal, which is salt, or we can form, in this particular case, a calcium oxalate crystal. And it turns out that oxalates themselves can affect the immune system as well as mitochondrial function. So we can think of oxalates as another toxin that could alter mitochondrial activity. So there's a lot to think about and correlate with regards to these tests, but what's to me has always been crystal clear is that in order to identify a problem of these underlying toxins or pathogens, you need to test for them. You can't just assume something is there or not there, without laboratory information. The treatment options for mold is complicated and extensive. So we're not going to get into all the details here because it is a complicated problem. What is clear though is that eliminating the source of exposure is very important, because if you're living in a moldy environment, you can do all the binders and all the antifungals you want. You're not likely going to get rid of what's building up in the body. And so, that's a tall order for certain individuals depending on their particular circumstances. Home mold remediation can be absolutely necessary if the home or a school or an office is the source of toxicity. Now, there's many interventions that can help reduce mold exposure or the toxic load, from using antifungal medications to antioxidant therapy to detoxification. And there's many different types of medications, from nystatin to sporanox to others, which can help basically get after the mold that is present. Glutathione is often helpful because it helps to detoxify the body of these mycotoxins. Binders, these are important supplements or even medications that basically what they're doing is they're binding up the toxins in the digestive system. So if something is coming, if you're breathing in, let's say, mold spores into the gut, well, the mold that's colonizing the digestive system can produce mycotoxins in the gut. So if you can bind things in the gut and prevent them from being absorbed, that can be helpful. You can also try to bind things as the body is detoxifying these mycotoxins, because some of them are going to go through the kidney and some of them are going to go through the liver into the digestive system. So the binder helps to basically soak up toxins in the gut. Sauna therapy, so sweating, can be helpful, and then just overall digestive system support can be useful too. There's many different types of supplements that are often helpful for yeast and Clostridia and even mold. When it comes to kids, it's always a bit of a challenge based on the taste factor of some of these supplements. Biocidin, for example, is a company I've used for years. One of the reasons I like their product so much is that their capsules are small. So even young children can be taught to swallow a small capsule. The ingredients in the supplements are very potent. And then they also have some liquid versions. They've got a regular liquid and a liposomal liquid, which actually are quite effective at decreasing pathogen load in the digestive system. So the other big deal that I think is really important when you're thinking of autism is, most of the individuals with autism we're working with are kids, and a lot of liquid botanicals just don't taste all that good. Well, Biocidin is different. It has a very pleasant taste. It's usually very palatable. I'm not going to say 100% of the kids out there are going to take to it, but by and large, the vast majority do without issue from a taste standpoint. Biocidin, the liquids can be used in different nasal spray, or what's called a neti pot, particularly for anybody who's been exposed to mold environmentally, where it's thought that perhaps you've got mold actually in the sinuses. This can be an effective intervention. This particular slide actually comes from what's called the Townsend letter. Townsend letter is a well-known journal that really focuses on integrative and functional medicine concepts. They had an article that came out about 4 years ago, and they were looking at different mycotoxins like aflatoxin, ochratoxin, and the trichothecenes, and then they gave a what mold was associated with those mycotoxins, and then what binders often are helpful. So for example, I'll talk about here in a second, something called cholestyramine, which is a prescription binder, is effective against ochratoxin. But you can also bind up ochratoxin with glucomannan, for example, something easily obtainable from a local health food store. A lot of the supplement companies who make glucomannan primarily use this as a supplement to help with weight. So it helps to kind of decrease appetite, essentially. It's where basically people feel like they're more full than they need to be, because it kind of fills the space within the stomach. Some of the clays, zeolite, for example, so they all have different binding capacities. I mentioned before cholestyramine. This has been used for a long time. It was originally developed to help with high cholesterol. So what it does is it binds cholesterol in the small intestine and prevents it from being reabsorbed. So it can have a lowering effect that way. But it's a darn good binder. The struggle with cholestyramine, particularly in kids, is it needs to be dosed multiple times throughout the day, upwards of 4 times a day. It's prescription, and that's somewhat of a limiting factor for some people. Palatability is an issue. It can also be fairly constipating, but it is highly effective. Activated charcoal has a purpose. We know that activated charcoal can be useful for just die-off of either yeast or Clostridia. It's probably not going to bind 100% of the mycotoxins, but it does a fairly good job. I tend to use a lot of, as a general binder, this product called GI Detox. And GI Detox comes from biobotanical research. It has some zeolite clay. It's got some charcoal in it. And so it's going to have it's a combination binder that does a pretty good job. Actually, a very good job overall as far as intestinal toxins go. And the nice thing is it's less constipating than just straight activator charcoal or just taking something like a clay product. So usually it's quite palatable for kids. Again, that's a variable. It's not like every child is going to take to these supplements, but it doesn't really have a taste, so it tends to mix well in liquid. Most of these binders, whether it's activator charcoal or GI Detox, they're best taken away from other supplements, okay, or food. So you have to find some time in the day to take these. Minimally twice a day, ideally 3 times a day would be preferred when you're dealing with some of the mycotoxins. So sometimes that can come out where you give something like GI Detox mid-morning between breakfast and lunch, mid-afternoon between lunch and dinner, and then sometime in the evening. And then just a combination, okay? So a combination essentially could be the incorporation of antifungal medication along with supplements. Whether you're doing medication like nystatin or Sporanox or another one called amphotericin, binders are often useful and really recommended, particularly for mycotoxin overload. When it comes to testing, I think it's a good idea to repeat your test within 90 days. So that would include repeating the mycotox profile at a 90-day interval, as well as the organic acid test. Now, one other thing I want to make you aware of is that you should always start with the full OAT, the organic acid test. If you're dealing or what you're looking to retest is primarily found on page 1 of the OAT, so you're looking primarily at the yeast and fungal markers, the Cholestyramine markers, and the other bacterial markers, you could repeat in 90 days what's called the microbial organic acid test. The microbial OAT, or what's called the MOAT, is essentially looking at the markers on page 1 of the larger organic acid test. So, you know, that's an option. This would also mean repeating your mycotox profile at 90 days as well. Sauna has its place. We know that sauna can be extremely helpful for chemical toxins. Sauna therapy, like the infrared sauna, which is a lower heat, you get the penetrating rays into the body. This has a mobilizing effect on toxins, including mycotoxins, that then it's thought perhaps are excreted in the sweat, but probably more likely they get mobilized and then detoxed through the liver or taken out through the urine. This could be, you know, certainly beneficial. So what I advocate for is don't skip the OAT. Okay, so if you just jump at the mycotoxins and you haven't evaluated the organic acid test, that to me is incomplete information. Do the OAT and the mycotox profile. Because if you're dealing with mycotoxins and you've got Clostridia or you've got other issues, those need to also be worked on as well. So both of these tests to me are important. There's a website called Lab Test Plus. Lab Test Plus carries access or provides access to many of the labs from Great Plains Laboratory and other labs too. The organic acid test, the mycotox profile, etc. So you go to Lab Test Plus and look at the menu of labs available. For any questions, you can email to labtestplus@gmail.com. Every lab ordered through Lab Test Plus comes with a written interpretation that talks about the relevant markers and then what's called action step suggestions. If you are a parent or a caregiver of an individual with autism and you want to have some interaction with me, I have an entire website called autismrecoverysystem.com that has a private forum. It's got an entire biomedical course, videos, articles, etc. You can post questions to me through the autismrecoverysystem.com website. If you are a healthcare practitioner and you want to get further training in the use of the organic acids test or other tests that Great Plains provides, then join us through the GPO Academy. So you can actually go to gpoworkshops.com. You'll also see upcoming events on the homepage of Great Plains Laboratory as well. So we had a very busy year in 2019, and it's shaping up to be a very busy year of travel and conferences coming up in 2020. I also, as I mentioned before at the beginning of this lecture, have my own online training academy called Integrative Medicine Academy. We have courses in SIBO, in toxicity, in autism, hormones, and we just recently launched a course called Advanced Oat Mastery Course. So this is for practitioners who have some experience in using the organic acids test from Great Plains Lab. Either you've been to a GPL Academy event or you've been using this in your practice for a while, and you're wanting to get into an advanced level as far as what this test is about. In this particular course, we're going through every single marker on the oat test, also correlating the information from different categories, case scenarios, lab reviews, etc. This course is currently going on now, and there's still slots available. If you're interested in joining, we're actually only 2 modules in. It's a 12-module course. It will go into 2020. You can go to advancedoatmasterycourse.com for more information. You can also text the word OAT, O-A-T, to 66866 and get access to this special report. Okay, so this is more information about the Advanced Oat Mastery Course. My partner, Dr. Trancatel, and I also provide for healthcare practitioners a mentoring program. So this is a one-on-one where we work with you one-on-one, whether it's over the phone or over the internet, on lab interpretation, Great Plains, other labs, clinical correlations, troubleshooting difficult cases, coming up with different options as far as intervention. So if you want more information about this program, you can contact our office directly at scmedicalcenter@gmail.com. We also have a section on our website as well regarding this health practitioner consultation service. And then I'm available for private consultations as well. If you are a parent with a child with autism, no matter where you are in the world, I do consults for people going through, again, clinical history, developing laboratory testing options, evaluating labs, treatment suggestions, etc. So you can contact our office directly at the email you see here, scmedicalcenter@gmail.com. Okay, so that is the information here for this month's webinar on autism and mycotoxins. I hope you found this useful. We will look forward to another installment coming up next month. If you did pose some questions, by the way, Great Plains will send those questions to me, and I'll answer back those questions through email. So, okay, everybody, thanks so much. This is Dr. Kurt Wohler again for the Great Plains webinars. Have a nice day. We'll talk to you soon. Take care.